Well, this morning I invite your attention to Hebrews chapter 5 and from verse 11 to the end of the chapter, verse 14. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 11 to 14. When I was here 2 months ago, I was preaching on some words in Hebrews chapter 4. We have a great high priest. Last time I was here, last month, we were looking at chapter 5 and the first few verses, and the subject there was, we have a perfect high priest, a great high priest and a perfect high priest. This writer has just started, chapter 4, on a section in his letter over which he will spend many verses. He will develop this very fully. He's talking about the priesthood of Christ. He's talking about the sacrifice of Christ. He's talking about comparing that with the old covenant priesthood and sacrifices, and showing that in every case, Christ has fulfilled the old. He's rendered it obsolete because he himself is the finished, final, full, complete high priest sacrifice. And by his precious blood, all who call upon the name of the Lord are saved. This is what he's going to develop from chapter 4 right to chapter 10 at the end. Even then he hasn't finished. He still brings certain points up from that. It's a very big subject to this man. Now you know why he's doing it. I've told you time and again, I'll just very briefly remind you, he's doing it because these Jewish believers are in danger of leaving Christ and going back to the old, going back to the shadows, the pictures, the illustrations, the signposts. No, he says, you stay with Christ, because Christ, and his key word is better. Christ is superior. We have a better covenant. We have a superior great high priest, a perfect high priest, and all the rest of it. Now you know there are two strands in this letter. He deals with all these old covenant shadows, Sabbath, land, temple. Well, he deals with the tabernacle, angels, Moses, Joshua, and showing Christ is superior. But also, time and again, he comes back to what we call warning passages, when he says very bluntly, do not go back from Christ. I'm not playing a game with you. I'm not just filling in some space. These are eternal matters which things have eternal consequences. And his warnings are some of the most strong warnings in all the Bible. And so you would expect this morning, having had two passages dealing with the priesthood, the great high priest, the perfect high priest, the next thing, naturally, will be a warning. And in versions of the Bible that I've been looking at, the people who try to be helpful, these Bible producers, they put the heading about warnings. And I think they've missed the point entirely. Because the passage this morning, verse 11 to verse 14, I don't think of that as a warning at all. This is not a warning. In fact, I think it's unique. I haven't checked it out, but I can't think off the top of my head of any passage like this in his entire letter. This is not a warning. It's something else. Now, this won't make me very popular. What is it that he's doing here? Well, let me just break off for a moment. Time and again, over the years, I've attended prayer meetings before a preaching service. Let's call it that. And people have prayed and asked God's blessing. Now, the sort of thing they've asked for is, Lord, give us an encouraging word. We want an encouraging word. And ministers are often thanked, I think, because they've given an encouraging word. You will see it in obituaries in the newspaper. We thank the Reverend so for his nice service. Nice service. Well, I have a word of warning for you. There is a warning. Watch out for preachers who give you nice sermons. Watch out for them. If I can use an illustration, watch out for doctors who are nice doctors. Now, I'm not saying that. Lloyd Jones said it, Martin Lloyd Jones. You know, he was a physician. And he said about physicians that he knew that had a wonderful bedside manner. Very nice. Oh, lovely. But their diagnosis was useless. Now, I would rather have a doctor, a GP, whose bedside manner was a bit rough. It'd be nice if he could be pleasant, but I'd rather have him if he was unpleasant, so long as he got the job done and did it right. I've had that experience. I think I've told you. 30 years ago, I went to see a consultant, and he said to me, how many times have you had it, this thing? And I said, well, I was walking along. He said, no, how many times have you had it? I said, well, when I bend down in the morning. He said, no, how many times have you had it? And he was quite nasty. And I said, I've had it 6 times. He said, you won't get it anymore. I came out of there thinking he was quite a nasty man, but he was dead right. I know a man who died recently. When he was a boy, he was evacuated down into Devon from London. And he was about 15, and he was working on a farm. His father was in the Navy. I think he'd lost his father at sea. I don't know all the account. But he was unwell, and he went to the local GP in Devon. Must have been 1940, I suppose, 41. And he said, I get a pain, he said. It starts here just above my lip, and he said, it travels down my face and all down my arm. And the doctor said to him, how old are you? He said, I'm 15. He said, well, get out of here and don't come back. Grow up. And Tom, my friend, came out of the surgery. He said, I'm never going back there again. And he never needed to. I've known a case where a young lady, I think for reasons I understand, had some kind of mysterious illness. I think it actually was because she was at university and not doing very well. But she had this mysterious illness, and she saw a young consultant. And I think he made a dreadful mistake. I'm talking 30 or 40 years ago. He said to her name, what do you think you've got? He was a consultant. What do you think you've got? And she said, I think I've got ME or MS, whatever it was. And he said, I think you're right, Janice. That poor girl has been bedridden ever since. What if he'd said, you've got nothing wrong with you? GPs shouldn't do that. I had a dear friend, I don't know whether she's still alive. She must be very old now. And she was very ill. There's no doubt about it. I won't go into details. But she went to the doctors one day, and he knew her very well, that she was suffering. But on this occasion, she said, I get a terrible pain in my arm. And she said, I can't even go on holiday. I just can't. And the doctor, who knew her very well, said, Sheila, there's nothing wrong with you. You've been nursing your mother. She's just died. And this is a psychosomatic reaction. There is nothing. I can give you all the smarties in the world, but it won't do any good. Was he right? Yes, he was right. All I'm saying to you is this. What is this passage about? Well, it's not a warning, it's a rebuke. That's what it is. He's telling his readers off. Well, you haven't come out, have you, to be told off? You haven't come out to be rebuked. No. But you know 2 Timothy chapter 3. God has inspired, breathed out his word. What for? To make things nice for us. For reproof. For rebuke. For correction. For instruction in righteousness. Why? That the man of God, the woman of God, the believer might be perfect, might be mature, might grow up. This is what this passage is about. 2 Timothy 3, 15, 16, 17. It's for the believer, growing in grace, growing in knowledge, growing in understanding. Now, why does he rebuke the people here? Well, listen to him. He's going on about the priesthood. He started. I think it's the most interesting passage. You can see into his mind. I'm showing you some trade secrets this morning. You can see into this man's mind. You can see how he's thinking. He's full of this priesthood. You can hear it in his voice. I can hear it. The priesthood, Christ. Yeah, wonderful. And then he says this. I've got so much to tell you about it, he said. I can hear his excitement. I'm so thrilled with this, but I can't do it. Why not? Because you haven't done your homework. Listen to him. Verse 11. Of whom? This is of Christ. I want to speak of Christ and his priesthood. I've got so much to tell you. I have many things to say. He talks about we, but that means he, I. I have many things to say and hard to be uttered. Now, what does he mean by that? They're hard to be uttered because, he says, seeing you are dull of hearing. You haven't been listening. Because you haven't got it. That's what he's saying to them. Now, I say this is a very interesting passage. It shows me something about a real teacher. There's a man inspired by God's Spirit teaching believers. And he shows us what we should expect from our teachers. I'm not talking about school now, although you can think of it as school. But I'm thinking of what we're doing now. What should you expect of me? I said I'm letting you into some trade secrets. Here they are. This man knows I've got all this material that I want to talk to you about, he said, but you can't take it. Because you haven't understood. Because you haven't grasped the first things I've told you. Now, what does that tell you about this writer? It tells you he's awake. And he knows what's going on in the people who are listening to him. He knows that they haven't got it. Now, you know that I was a schoolmaster for many years. And I taught mathematics. Okay, right. Now, I'm pretty sure that the advisors, the inspectors who would come to the school, didn't think anything of me at all. I'm pretty sure I had a very bad reputation. Because I was a very poor teacher. In this sense, they, the advisors, the inspectors, wanted from me a lesson plan. A lesson for each, a plan for each lesson, a plan for the week, a plan for the whole term, a plan for the whole year. They wanted me to have it all mapped out and have all my notes ready and all my examples and everything already written out, you see. Well, I didn't ever use any notes. I got no notes here. So I didn't have a lesson plan. Well, I did, but it was in there, in my head. When I went into business, the bank insisted that I give 2 years business plan. So I did it for them religiously. January, taking so much, expenses so much, profit so much. January, February, March, and I did it for 2 years. They ticked it and they accepted my application. It was a load of rubbish. Utter rubbish. How did I know what I was going to take? How did I know what it was going to cost? I only knew that by doing it. But they wanted a bit of paper. Come back to my lesson. Say I'm teaching quadratic equations. You remember that? Yeah. No. Right. I would start with so-and-so. I know where I start. If they get that, I'll move on to the next one. I'll move on to the next stage, and on to the next stage. On. How far would I go? As far as they let me. If they were getting it, I would go on. If they weren't getting it, I would have to stop and try again with another method. Try another illustration to show them, to help them. How did I know they were getting it? Because I can see. Now, why am I saying this so much detail? Today, I listen to preachers who are not looking at you, they're looking at their notes. They're looking at their tablets. And they're going to deliver what they've got, whether you get it or not. Now, the great preacher, the proper preacher, knows you haven't got it. And if you haven't got it, he stops and goes back and tries again. You see, it's not the notes. Don't misunderstand me. It's not even the Bible. It's the people listening that count. What do you mean? I'm not here just to say what this text says. I could talk out in the street to nobody and just say what the text says. I'm interested in you, believe it or not. I haven't traveled here just to talk. I've traveled here for you. I've used this illustration before. My wife was in Addenbrooke's intensive care, very seriously ill. And one Sunday afternoon, it was a Sunday afternoon, I think, and the dials were going berserk in this intensive care. And I said to the nurse, the sister, I said, look at the dials, you know. And she said, that's exactly what a trainee nurse said to me once. And what I said to the trainee nurse was, look at the patient. Look at the patient. The patient's all right. What was she saying? What counts is not the dial, is the patient. What counts here this morning, my friend, is not the exposition of Scripture. The primary thing is you. And me, of course. We've got to get it. And if we don't get it, I just want to talk to the man in the moon. That's what this man says. I want to talk to you. I want to explain. He said, but I can't because you're slow of hearing. It's a reproof. When I was preaching regularly, I used to use an illustration. Have you seen cowboy films? You know, when they have a hoedown, is that what they call it? A dance? The cowboy goes in, and what do they do at the door? They unbelt their guns, okay? They take off their guns and put them on the table. We don't want any shooting in here tonight, thank you. So unbelt your guns. Leave your guns at the door. And I used to say to people, don't unbelt your brains. Brains are wanted. Keep your brain active. I've got my part, but we've all got our part as hearers too. You become dull of hearing. And to help these people, again, another mark of a good teacher, he's prepared to use illustrations. Look at the illustrations. Verses 11 to 14. I said I got no notes. Well, I have. It's these verses. Here they are. Verse 12. You need somebody to teach you again, he says. And he used the illustration in verse 12. Look at it at the end. You become such as have need of milk and not strong meat. You can all understand this illustration because you've all been there. We've all been here. What is he talking about? Well, we've all been there in our own right, and many of us have been there because we've had children. Do you remember? The baby's born. And not long after the baby's born, it begins to cry. Why? Because it wants feeding. And it wants feeding night and day, especially night. Do you remember? Yeah, some of you do. Yeah. Middle of the night. Oh, not again. Yeah, okay. It wants feeding. And you feed the baby. What do you feed it on? Milk. The baby grows. You give it more milk. But it's not long, especially when you've had 2 or 3. It's quicker then. You want to get them off the milk. And what do? You start taking some food, a bit of potato, a bit of apple or something, and you mash it very soft and pappy. And you gradually introduce that to the baby, don't you? It's called weaning. You've all been there. You've all been weaned. And most of us have had a go at weaning others too. After a little while, the baby is sitting up. And the next stage is you have to teach the baby to feed itself. And you give it a little plate, a little fork and a little spoon, a little pusher with soft food, don't you? And you did the same as us. You put a piece of plastic on the floor. Why? You won't allow the baby to chuck the food on the floor. I'm not saying that. But even with the best will in the world, the baby will try to put the food in its mouth and it sticks it up its nose or whatever. It makes a mess of it. But what do? You go on letting it experiment. You go on training it. You go on weaning it. If you didn't do that, I had 3 children. They're now 60. Imagine them walking around with a milk bottle all day. You congratulate me, wouldn't you? You've done a wonderful job. Of course we haven't. You introduced them to cabbage and pickled onions and cheese and all the rest of it. I remember I don't know whether it's still the case, but my wife had to take the child to the postnatal clinic, I think it was, once a month or something, and they weigh the baby. Oh, congratulations, it's put on 25 pounds or whatever it was. And I remember one day she came home and they said, you can now feed Simon on sultanas or currants or something. Jean didn't say that for about the last 3 weeks she'd been eating sultanas. He wasn't digesting them, but he was passing through him. You had to experiment. You had to feed. Listen, he said, you've got need of milk. You're 60 years old, spiritually speaking, but you're still feeding on milk. 1 Peter 2, there is a place for milk, the sincere milk of the word when you're infant. But when you're growing, you want to get onto beef and carrots and peas and all the rest of it, and sprouts. This is the illustration he's using. For everyone that uses milk, verse 13, if you stick at milk, that's a very bad sign indeed. The thing is to wean the child. And this weaning is more than just milk and meat. I remember when Simon, my boy, he must have been about 8 or 9 months, I don't know. I remember I had to carry him. I could carry him for a few minutes, and after a few minutes, he was getting heavy by then. Ooh, the weight on my arms. Can I just put him down? No, I couldn't, because he couldn't stand. But I can remember the time now, the relief, when I could just drop him gently to the floor and his legs could make him stand. The relief that he was independent, that I could put him down. Imagine I was still carrying him, 60-year-old man, but I could stand him there. Of course, I had other problems. We both had, my wife and I had other problems. We invested in something, I don't know whether they have it now. We invested in reins. Do you remember reins? A kind of harness here, and it's a kind of blue thing we had with long leather straps. Because as soon as I put him down, he wanted to wander off. And what would I do? I yanked the reins up, and his feet came off the floor. So he didn't walk into the road. But those are the problems of life and growing, and you want those problems to wean them. Years later, I remember when my second child, she came to me one day and said, Dad or Father, I forgot what she called me, do you think I could afford to have a place of my own? And she did. Wasn't long after that, she was going to get married, and I can picture it now. It must be, 30 years ago? But I can see standing on the drive now, that evening when she was driving off. She was getting married to a man in London, and so she transferred from the branch of Halifax in Lowestoft to a London branch. And she was driving off in her car, Poppy, we called it, P-O-P. It was a pale blue car. I can see it now, driving off. And the feeling in my mind, in my heart, as this girl, young lady, drove off. She was leaving. But that was the whole object of the bringing up the child. I've passed through many phases in my life, and you have been the same. At one time, I was the kingpin in my house. Now, I'm the old codger stuck in the corner. Once I was master, but now I'm just pushed aside. But that's the whole object of it, because these people are growing up and independent, and they can manage their lives. In fact, they manage me. This is what this man is after. Everyone who stays a baby is something we would weep over. Strong meat belongs to them who are of full age. Even those who by reason of use, they've tried feeding themselves, they make a terrible mess. They put it in their ear instead of their mouth. Yeah, okay, yeah, but it is a mess. But they have to learn. They have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. In other words, they know what they like. They get used to that taste. They try pickled onions, they don't like it, but they try again, not too bad, and away it goes. Of course, this man is not talking about bread and cheese. He's not talking about living in cars and going off to get married. He's talking about spiritual things. He's talking about me standing here to teach you and know what's going on. And if you're not getting it, well, that's not too bad. I've given my sermon. No. Think about the patient. Why is he so concerned? What is he getting so uptight about? because he has an end in mind. He's got an aim. He's after something. I'd like to ask all the pastors I know, what's your aim? What is your aim this morning? What do you want? Judging by the sermons I hear, and I hear a lot more now than ever I used to, the aim seems to be, well, I want to be very accurate on whatever the text is. Genesis 5 verse 8, whatever it might be. I want to be very accurate about that. I'm concerned to get the truth exactly right. I've been working at it all week, getting my notes exactly right, and I don't want to put a foot wrong. That's my aim. Well, if that's your aim, sir, get out of the pulpit. That's what I would say to him. If that's your aim, get out. You've got no rights to be up here. What should your aim be? I'll tell you what the aim should be. Here it is, verse 12. It's not me making it up. It's in verse 12, and it's all over the New Testament. It's all over the Bible. What is? What is the point of me teaching you? What is the point of having somebody coming here tonight and somebody coming next week and somebody, whatever? What's it all about? So that he can give all this truth out. No. Listen, for the time you ought to be teachers. Now, he's not talking to people in the theological college. He's talking to you. Yes, you ladies as well. Yeah, you ladies, you listening, and you gentlemen and all the rest of it, yeah. If you're a believer, he's talking to you. And he's saying to you, for the time you ought to be teachers. Eh? This man wants every believer to be a teacher. Well, that's crackers. No, it's not. This afternoon, read Ephesians chapter 4, especially 11 to 16, but read the whole chapter. And you will see what I'm saying is right. The work of the ministry, if you like, the work of preaching, is so that we can all teach each other. That famous text in Hebrews 10, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. Oh, yeah, that means go to a preaching service. No, it doesn't. It means do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together, that you may encourage and teach and instruct each other. Read Hebrews 10 for yourself. Brother and sister in Christ, the whole work of the ministry, if you like to call it that, what I'm doing now is to train us so that we can become teachers of one another. You can teach me. You can encourage me. You can rebuke me. This is what the ministry is. Now that's all gone out of the window. It's something called Christendom. What's come in? The pastor, and he teaches you, and instead of he teaching you so that you can teach one another, he teaches you so that you become dependent on him. Oh, you're making it up. Oh? Well, I could talk about people today. I could give you examples of men doing it even now as I'm speaking. But let's go back into history. Let's go back to Martin Lloyd-Jones. Let's go back to Charles Haddon Spurgeon. All right? Well, you won't like this, but listen. What happened when Charles Haddon Spurgeon finished at Met Tab when he died? What happened? Now, this man was a Calvinist. What do? They called an Arminian. They went from free grace to free will overnight. How is that possible? I had a friend who was taking Lloyd-Jones back to London one day after preaching in Bradford-on-Avon in Wiltshire. And as he was driving back, he said, Dr. Lloyd-Jones, How is it that after Spurgeon died, the people at Mettab went from Calvinism to Arminianism? And Lloyd Jones said, it's because Spurgeon was not an expository preacher. He didn't expound the scriptures, he quoted texts. Well, if Lloyd Jones was still alive, I'd like to ask him a question. Dr. Lloyd Jones, how is it that after you died, Westminster Chapel went from expository preaching, Calvinistic preaching, went to the nonsense that's there today? And the answer, my friend, is not what Lloyd Jones said. The answer is, instead of training the people to teach, they train the people to be dependent. That's what I'm getting worked up about. I've written about it. And if you're interested, you only got to mention it. I'll give you a booklet on it, which I've written. But, I mean, the point is this. Ephesians chapter 4. The whole point, Hebrews chapter 10. The whole point is we should be growing so that we can teach each other. This man is held up because he knows the people haven't got it. Now, when I was a school teacher, if I had a bad lesson, I could blame myself if I hadn't taught properly. But if it's the fault of the pupils because they're not doing their homework, because they're not putting the examples in, if they're not learning from me, if their minds are out the window, whatever it might be, then it's their responsibility. Of course, as a teacher, I was trying to get them to do it, so I rebuked them. But my friends, for us, the whole business of our meeting together should be a mutual edification. Above all, of course, to see Christ and be able to teach Christ to one another. I want to encourage you. It is a word of rebuke. Yes, it is. It is a word of rebuke. But it's a word of encouragement. What a privilege to be a child of God, to not only know Christ for oneself, but be able to help others. Francis Ridley Havergal wrote this: Lord, speak to me, that I may speak in living echoes of thy tone, as thou hast sought. So let me seek, oh, help me, thy erring children lost and lone. Oh, lead me, Lord, that I may lead the wandering and the wavering feet. Oh, feed me, Lord, that I may feed thy hungering ones with manna sweet. Oh, strengthen me, not just for my sake, that while I stand firm on the rock and strong in thee, I may stretch out a loving hand to wrestlers with the troubled sea. Be a help to other believers, and even to some poor sinner. Oh, teach me, Lord, that I may teach the blessed things, the precious things thou dost impart. Oh, wing my words, that they may reach the hidden depths of many a heart. Oh, fill me with thy fullness, Lord, until my very heart o'erflow, in kindling thought and glowing word, thy love to tell, thy praise to show. I'm trying to show you the privilege of being in God's service, doing something, saying something, pointing someone somewhere to Christ. What a privilege. What a privilege. Oh, use me, Lord, use even me, just as thou wilt, and when and where, until thy blessed face I see, thy rest, thy joy, thy glory share. That's what that poor woman wanted. And blessed be God, her words are still echoing today. So it is a rebuke. If you haven't been putting the work in, take the rebuke, my friend. But the privilege, the prospect. Lord, can I be used in your service? Then here am I. Send me. Remember Isaiah? Who will go for us? Lord, send me. Yes, even you.